Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this final TTF webinar for the year. We're very pleased to see you all here this morning, and we've got a great panel to talk for you, I think, at a very exciting time for the industry. We're going to talk a little bit about where everybody is holidaying this summer and what kind of trends we expect to see. Together with MI Associates, we've done a consumer research piece just to have a look at and discover exactly where people are going and what they're planning on doing over the summer holidays. Now, I think the link for that full report was sent to everybody this morning, so please do enjoy. It's a great piece of work, and we were very thrilled to be doing it with James and his team. I'll be the moderator for this morning's webinar, and we're going to start with a bit of a discussion, and then we will go to Q&A. I'll be monitoring questions, so if you've got a burning question to ask one of the members of our panel, please do send it on through, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. So to introduce our panel this morning, I'd like to welcome, of course, Tracy Foxall, who's the Regional Manager, Oceania for Booking.com. Welcome, Tracy. The fabulous Leanne Harwood, Managing Director, Australasia and Japan for the Intercontinental Hotel Group. Felicia Mariani, the Chief Executive Officer for VTIC, the Victorian Tourism Industry Council, who's been doing such a mighty job in Victoria with some incredibly difficult circumstances. Of course, James Patterson, the Director from MI Associates, and what I can only describe as probably one of the busiest men in Australia at the moment, Richard Wormald, who's the Division President, Australasia for MasterCard, and I hope everybody's out there spending lots of money. I'm doing my best, Richard. Right, let's get into it then. These are sort of, testing times for all of us. And I suppose one of the things that strikes me most about it is what do we think the biggest change to traveller behaviour is going to be over this summer holiday period? Is everybody just going to snap back into what we've all seen previously, or are we already starting to see a bit of a trend and a change in the way people are approaching their summer break? Tracy, we might start with you.
Yeah, I think probably one of the most logical changes we've seen is both a shortening of the lead time. So vast majority of our bookings at the moment are coming in only for December and January at this stage. We're seeing very little pass there, whereas normally we'd see a much longer lead time at this time of year. And I think a huge push, almost all reservations that are coming through are being made on flexible policies. So even though there's some return to accommodation listing with other policies, we're still seeing a massive desire from customers to have flexibility in their bookings.
Interesting. Leanne, from your point of view, because we're a long way off business travel coming back, but you do have some amazing leisure properties as well.
We do, and thank goodness for the regional leisure properties, which have kept us buoyed throughout this time. And I mean, I think we've all experienced everybody trying to get out on the weekends. But the great thing is we've started to see a shift coming back into the city hubs, and that's really been in line when we've started to see things like the galleries open up again and events starting to happen. So, those leisure travellers now are starting to come back into the city for us, which is great news. Still way off for business yet, but the good news is there's still leisure travellers are heading our way.
Yes, we'd like everybody to go to Frozen and stay 3 nights in Sydney when they do it. So, Richard, on that wider spending, what are you seeing that's a bit different this year, or is it just the same?
Well, I think what's been interesting, Margy, is that the customer behaviour in Australia has been very consistent with that we've seen in Europe, in the US. And if you go back to the lockdown period, we saw very consistent changes. Clothing spend dropped 50%, alcohol spend went up 20%, hardware spending went up 30%. So you can surmise that we were all sitting at home in our pajamas, not needing another business shirt, having a bottle of wine and thinking about fixing the jobs around the house. And what's been interesting, as we've come out of lockdown, we've seen actually higher levels of spend in those entertainment, eating out type categories than we did pre-COVID. And I know from my own experience, trying to get a booking at a restaurant or a winery between now and Christmas is almost impossible. So I think there's clearly pent up demand for people to get out and enjoy their freedom. And I think when it comes to travel, that will also hold, that we'll see people wanting to go out and travel again, we saw international spend on travel overseas spend drop nearly 90% through the lockdown, and it hasn't come back. And the area that's actually most impacted, it should be no surprise, is actually inbound tourism. It's still just completely gone. So there's a long way for the industry to come back, but I think we should be encouraged by that kind of release from freedom, as all acting like first-year university students again and going out every night of the week. Hopefully that will also follow through into people's travel intentions in the year ahead.
And thank you for that insight into your graduate behaviour there, Richard. Partying every night. Well done. James, from your point of view, the survey was national. What were the sort of trends? We're going to talk to Felicia about the very particular issues in Victoria, because I think it's got a different flavour to it across the board. But what were the standouts for you from the research?
One of the big things, I think, was that there's still a residual fear around COVID, and 25% of people are just going to be staying at home due to those reasons exactly. So there's still this sentiment that people aren't prepared to get out there and travel around. But of those who are doing it, the very interesting thing is that 75% of them are reviving the great Aussie road trip. So those people intending to travel over summer, only 15% of them are going to do that by plane, and 75% of them are going to stay in their state or territory. So people are staying reasonably close to home, and the Aussie road trip is back.
This is this 2 to 4 hour donut around the capital cities too, isn't it? Which, brings with it some challenges as well.
It is, but what we found of the people that travelled during COVID, so 33% of Australians got out there and travelled within their state or territory during COVID. There's now this, the love of their own car and the road trip is back. And so when we asked them how far people would travel, now we're seeing there's a propensity amongst Australians to travel, perhaps 1 to 2 hours further than they would have otherwise. So it's really broadening the net of where people might otherwise travel.
Well, that's good news. Now, Felicia, Victoria's had a particularly tough time. I keep saying to people, you've had the triple whammy, whereas everybody else just had, bushfires and COVID. You've had bushfires, COVID and COVID. How are things going? What do you see as the big trends that you're seeing now that the barriers and the borders are down a bit?
Yeah, Margy, it has been, it's been a year everyone will be so happy to see the backside of from here in Victoria. I listen with envy, James, as you were talking about people travelling during COVID, because we couldn't. We had the entire metropolitan Melbourne locked down with only 5 Ks that we could wander from our front door. And let me tell you, after 112 days of that, I was ready to pull my hair out. But I think the good news is things have bounced back really quickly here. From the moment that the Premier announced that the Ring of Steel would come down on the 8th of November, which was the week prior, phones started ringing hot. But what we are seeing, unfortunately, is this evolution of what we're talking about here is a 2-speed recovery. And, obviously, Greater Melbourne is getting out and about, wide open spaces, clean, green, nature-based activities, all high on the list of what our, consumers are looking for here, but that screams regional. And of course, our Melbourne-based properties are really hurting. Both Sydney and Melbourne realistically are heavily reliant on international business events and major events. And all 3 of those things, at least here in Victoria, I have to say, again, we watch with envy in Sydney. Your major sporting venues now, outdoors are up to 100% capacity again, and indoor venues at 75%. Our MCG for the Boxing Day test has just been held to 30,000. Which was, I have to say, a pretty big disappointment, because the hotels were really looking for the opportunity to bounce back a bit through that. We also now have the understanding that we don't have a final date, but certainly the Open is not going to happen in January. It will happen in February. There have been dates flown around of the 8th of Feb and lots of other rumours, but we're still waiting to find out. Bottom line is, though, that now means a great big fat hole in January as well for our Melbourne-based properties who were looking very forward to the opportunity to have a bit of a recovery through January. So this 2-speed recovery is becoming a real issue for us here. And one of the things I really want to mention, and maybe we can talk about this as well, but I don't want anybody to think just because things are starting to bounce back, job done, because we have a long road to hoe. You know, this is a 4-year recovery that everybody's planning for. Victoria has lost 79% of its spend. The estimate will be 79% by the time we get to the year end, June 21. You know, it's $23 billion wiped off of our visitor spend in this state. So we've got a massive road to recovery. And just because hospitality is firing, it doesn't mean that the tourism industry is all happy days. So I think that's the one thing that we're really conscious of and that we're really working hard to keep on, you know, on the front of the agenda.
I couldn't agree with you more, Felicia. I think this is the, you know, we have to fight this issue of government complacency that says, oh, look at that lovely Aussie tourism boom. We can't recover without the internationals, and we've still got a long way to go. Having said that, I mean, I think, Richard, you touched on the international situation. I just wonder if we can diverge for a moment, Tracy, Leanne and Richard in particular, to just get some further insights from you on what you're seeing overseas, perhaps in Europe, the US, and maybe some of those parts of Asia like Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, to give us a bit of a heads up on whether, you know, how good, bad or indifferent things are scoping in those places. Tracy, I might start again with you.
Yeah, I think we see, I guess, similar trends globally, depending on what's happening with lockdown. So what we have seen almost everywhere is that travel is very resilient. So as soon as people are able to, there is pent-up demand that we see surging very quickly. But as you touched on, I think for a lot of destinations that rely more heavily on international business, there's a very fast surge, and I think some complacency that comes with that actually, in terms of the volumes that come through initially, and then but very staggered still towards kind of weekends and little peaks of short holidays. So for majority of kind of CBD hotels globally, we see the same challenge where there's issues kind of midweek. A lot of the beach destinations are doing well, and a lot, I think, actually comes from confidence in the safety of requirements with sanitization and other things. So I think there's just a huge amount to be played, I think, for the role of government and all industry in terms of trying to get confidence back in terms of the security and safety of travel.
And look, I think there's a whole range of big issues there we need to come back and have a chat about in terms of that confidence factor and what we can do. But Leanne, can I just come to you on this issue of what's happening internationally, and also maybe some of the unique issues in terms of the accommodation industry having to worry about hygiene, quarantining, all those kinds of things?
Yes, look, it's interesting. Europe, of course, UK is just going back into a major big lockdown, so they are in a world of pain and continue to flip-flop back with their occupancies and open and shutting hotels, which has been incredibly frustrating and difficult for them. And Southeast Asia is starting to come back out of it, but very much what Tracy was talking about is it's all around the leisure-based destinations, weekends, etc., and with minimal business coming through on the weekdays. What's been interesting is where we've done very well is where the government has lent in and supported the various countries or economies by doing supportive projects. Like in Japan, the government's come out with a Go To Travel campaign where they're subsidising people to get out and travel amongst Japan. And quite frankly, that's been a huge saver for us because they've come out and invested in that, and they keep extending it, you know, as the COVID continues to unfortunately have a bit of a lift in Japan at the moment. I mean, and we've seen that closer to home here with South Australia, you know, when they've done the voucher system, you know, whenever the government gets behind us and really supports us by doing little initiatives like this, you know, we absolutely as an industry benefit for that. So I think that's been the big play and the big message that we're seeing China, like everywhere, which is when we can work together, we get better results that come back out of the end of it. To your second question, Margy, yep, it's certainly been a challenging time, obviously, to try and build that confidence back in the consumer and the traveller, to get them to come back into an environment where they're going to get closer contact with people and where they're going to go and stay in the areas that they haven't been in control of to clean themselves. So, you know, all of the big chains and you know, even the smaller operators have come out and really put the efforts into trying to increase the cleanliness and various promises and various commitments to the consumer to give that confidence to them. The flip side to that is the challenge of course, offsetting the costs, because, you know, we're trying to attract people to travel into our hotels by giving wonderful package opportunities, which have a tendency to be a little bit discounted to try and attract the business in. But what's happened is their costs have increased in actually us being able to deliver a clean and safe environment, be it through staff, be it through, you know, various cleanly means. And it really comes down to a long-term viable option to make a hotel profitable, right? And it's getting harder and harder as we go through this.
Richard, from your perspective, because, you know, I mean, I think we're all kind of very keen to understand what the spending insights are in different parts of the world. And is Australia ahead of the pack or not? Are we a bit more confident or not?
Unfortunately not. So if you start with the global picture, travel spend on international travel is down between 40 and 60% on a global basis. In Australia, it's down 90%. And that makes sense given our borders are closed. So other markets that are doing well, if we look at the air travel capacity that's on hand in China, it's back to pre-COVID levels. It's actually been back to pre-COVID levels since about July. Japan's been running at 88% of air capacity. It's normal. And I think until we open our borders, we're not going to get anywhere near those levels. And that's going to have a material impact on our travel industry. As we were talking earlier, that inbound tourism is absolutely critical to recover the industry. And that is going to take, I think, many, many years. At a local level, I actually traveled from Melbourne to Sydney last week, and it's just interesting how different the atmosphere is in Melbourne and Sydney. Because I think the mask wearing rules are still in place. In Melbourne, you wear your mask in the car, through the airport, on the plane. You get to Sydney, throw it in the bin, and you never use it again. And it feels like you've been released from prison, arriving in Sydney. Whereas there's still a palpable level of fear in the community, I think very much induced by the way that the pandemic's been handled in Victoria. And I think that will have an impact on the recovery. And in fact, we see it in the aggregate spend data. Victoria is still lagging. So I think until we get to more uniform restrictions between Victoria and the other states, unfortunately, I think Victoria will continue to be a laggard.
Well, it's not great news. I'm going to come back to you in a second, James, just to talk about this confidence thing. But Felicia, I think, you know, your thoughts on that from a Victorian point of view. Do you think, even though there was a bit of pent up demand for everybody wanting to get out, there's still a level of nervousness within the Victorian travel economy?
Yeah, I mean, there is absolutely, from a sentiment survey point of view, people do want to get out. Visit Victoria has done a lot of work in that space, as have a number of others. But there is still that underlying concern. It was interesting. We had a presentation 2 weeks ago from the strategic planner at Clemenger BBDO, and they've been doing an Australia Now survey nationally since about April, have spoken to over 40,000 people across the country. And this was general sentiment, not just tourism sentiment. But even at that level, I think it was 58%, just over half of the people still said that there are concerns about another wave of COVID and what that's going to mean for their health, for their safety, for their security. You know, we're finding here that people, I've heard an operator say to me, people are more interested in what your cleaning procedures are and what your safety procedures are than they are about what's on your menu or where the food comes from. So it's really interesting that top of mind has been around safety and security. We obviously have a lot of regional towns in the very early days who were not real keen, especially to have people from Melbourne. That was a real hurdle to get over. I think we've gotten past that now. The one good thing that I think that has come out of this process is for some places who maybe hadn't necessarily appreciated the value of tourism in their regional communities, this has really shown how critical and the critical role that tourism plays in the economic fabric and the economic viability of our regional areas across Victoria. So it has really helped to escalate the importance of the visitor economy as drivers of local economy. So that's been a good thing, but it is getting balanced with this fear factor. Now we're starting to get over that, but it is interesting to hear your comments, Richard, because we have been talking about the need to get some consistency across the states around rules and regulations and who does what, where, and how, and when. We have been fortunate that at least the mask wearing is no longer mandatory. You're required to wear it. You're correct in a taxi or Uber. You have to wear it where you can't socially distance and inside supermarkets. But aside from that, it's no longer mandatory. But it's really interesting watching the people still walking around with masks on. I was in Queenscliff recently, and before I walked in shops, because some people had them on, some people didn't, I asked, am I supposed to wear a mask? And some of the shops actually asked me to put one on, even though it's not mandatory. So it's quite interesting just watching the difference of how people are, I guess, almost relaxing into a new normal, or as we're calling it, a COVID normal summer here in Victoria. But it is a consistent challenge for us, and it will take a while to overcome. There is an underlying fear here, I think, for us, because having gone through this twice, Lord knows we can't manage 3 times. I don't think I personally could not survive a 3rd lockdown, and Lord only knows our businesses wouldn't.
Yeah. Sobering. Thank you, Felicia. James, from your point of view, as part of the data we collected on this, the whole confidence issue and how people are feeling is something we've really got to pay a lot of attention to, and it's not going to be an easy fix. What was the data telling you?
Yeah, so as Felicia's just pointed out, the research clearly showed that Victorians were most concerned about COVID issues, not unsurprisingly. New South Wales second, but then we saw across South Australia, West Australia and Queensland, particularly with West Australia and Queensland, only half of their residents were concerned about it, given how successfully they've been able to keep COVID out of their respective states. So there's definitely a need for more communication and making people feel safe. And certainly people were right across the issue around governments doing more around that fact and being able to put campaigns in place that will help alleviate some of those fears and really raise the level of of concern, of alleviating all that concern.
Thanks, James. Leanne, I'm just going to dive back to you just to sort of talk a little bit more about this issue of CBDs. I mean, the tourism industry is a whole lot of pieces of the puzzle, whether it be city or regional, but there's a particular problem with our CBDs and reactivating them and getting people to come back to work and getting people to travel for business again. Are you seeing any change in that space anywhere else in the world? I mean, what do you think are the factors that are going to make a difference? Is it the creative arts? Is it major events? Is it just the confidence factor?
Yeah. Probably the only place that we're really starting to see the shift of it getting back to a normal environment, both weekend and weekday patterns, is Greater China. Where they're well and truly coming out of the pandemic and of starting to get into a natural way of doing business and certainly not back up to the levels of previous, but they're absolutely heading in the direction. And I think that's really come from a level of confidence that their travellers have got with their government and how that they're managing through this. It's critical for us, Margy, that we have to get business coming back through in the weekdays for our industry, right? So there's there's only so many leisure guests that can come and travel during the week, and we've only got 2 or 3 days on the weekend where we're able to fill our hotels in the city with those leisure guests. So the events definitely help. Anything that we've got with galleries opening up, or the Sydney Festival coming on board, etc., just has a huge opportunity for us. But we need to get business travel going. We need to get meetings happening again. And on a positive note, we're starting to see inquiries coming through for Q1 for next year for business events to happen again. Now, the challenge is getting them to actually convert. So what they're doing is they're tentatively dipping their toes in and saying, look, we'd be quite keen to understand what sort of things you've got available for us, and how are you going to manage the environment for us when we do come and hold a meeting? How is it going to be COVID safe? And that's been becoming even more and more critical for the industry across the board, is to have a plan in place on how we do that, just to get them to that level of confidence where we can really take those booking inquiries and actually get them to come in. So, I think, to your point, it is about getting a confidence level to travel. For big footsie companies, there's a liability component that it goes underpins, their ability to travel, and all of that. There's not a silver bullet, unfortunately. There's multiple arms that are going to need to be people being confident with before they can get back out again. We can see a real return coming back.
Thank you. I mean, Richard, from this CBD perspective, and let's just think about retail. I don't want you to think that I'm completely obsessed with shopping, but just thinking about that for a moment. In conversations we've had with the national retailers here, they've been over the last month or so predicting that the recovery time for the Sydney CBD from a retail point of view would be 4 to 5 years, and in Melbourne it might be as much as a decade. How much business is actually now transferred online? Can you see that I'm assuming you can, in terms of, are people shopping that much more online, and has there been a bit of a surge that we would normally hope to see at Christmas from a retail point of view?
There has. In fact, the Cyber Monday, Black Friday weekend was the biggest ever in Australia. We actually saw volumes up year on year about 50%. And what's interesting is you've got customers that are shopping online for the first time. And what we're seeing is they're not going back from the time that they trial it. So I think you've seen a permanent shift up in the level of shopping online. I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing for retailers. It does mean a fundamental re-engineering of their supply chains. And you see Australia Post clearly well beyond its normal capacity at the moment. So I think over the next few years, there's going to be a fundamental rethink of how many stores that retailers operate, how much investment they put into their online distribution capability, and so on. And unfortunately, I think that means that we're going to see shops closing in high streets and in shopping centres and in the CBDs. And I think the CBDs are going to be particularly badly impacted by possibly a trend to more hybrid working. So more, a couple of days in the office, a couple of days at home. And that will fundamentally impact the level of foot traffic that we're going to see through the CBD areas. We look at the transit data on a weekly basis. Now we have open loop transit in Sydney. Sydney is actually back to about 70% of pre-COVID usage of public transport. Melbourne is nowhere near that. It's so far down. It's quite concerning. So I completely agree that there's going to be a long-term recovery, but I wonder if we actually need a fundamental rethink of the usage of the space in the CBD, because if there are fewer shops and offices are being used in a different way, there isn't going to be the demand for that. So I think there's actually a structural change in the composition of activity in our CBDs that will happen.
Interesting. Felicia, I mean, from your point of view, Melbourne has always prided itself on being the shopping capital, and I suppose to a degree, cultural arts and major events. All of that's been turned on its head. How does Melbourne come back as a destination? And you know, what are we likely to see in terms of the time frame on this recovery?
I mean, undoubtedly it's going to take a while, but I have to say there have been some very recent shoots of change that have been really positive. Number one, I would agree, Richard, one of the biggest concerns is getting people back on public transport, but I have to say I've been privy to a campaign that the Department of Transport is looking to implement down here to build that confidence level. They're doing some amazing stuff around helping people to feel confident, looking at how they manage the crowds on public transport, which is the biggest concern. So I think early in the new year, there's a campaign that they're going to be running, which will go a long way to some of the comments that you've made, Richard. I think in terms of CBD personality, again, the City of Melbourne has done some tremendous work. I don't know if anyone's following some of the stuff that they keep posting on LinkedIn, but, you know, they've done incredible pop-ups around the city. They've done, you know, incredible floral displays that have popped up all around Melbourne. They've got now live pop-ups of entertainment in the laneways. They've entered into a partnership with the state government, and each of them have put in $50 million to help to activate the city centre. And we've got parklets that are being set up right now as we speak, which will create a whole new unique outdoor dining experience. So they're really looking at how they bring activation out onto the streets, which is terrific at this time of the year. But again, to the point about the empty shops and some of the concerns there, they're also looking at how do they put entertainment inside some of those empty shop fronts so that they don't look empty, so that the city doesn't look like everything's for lease. So they really are working on activation and regeneration of the city. The biggest issue, however, is getting that foot traffic back into the city. We have upped workers coming into the city went up to 25% recently. And as of the 11th of January, that figure will go up to 50%. And 25% of the public service is allowed to come back into the city from the 11th of January as well to return to the offices. That's actually the first step in that reactivation, because we need the footfall of the city workers to actually really regenerate our city. So there are moves being made, but it keeps coming back to that confidence level, because even though 50% of people are allowed back, will 50% of people come back? So, you know, there's a whole lot of machinations, I guess, going on in that space right now. But, you know, there is a big drive to really push the regeneration of the city, to get the footfall back into the city, which then lends itself to better retail and better hospitality. Mind you, you can't get a booking in Melbourne restaurants right now, so I'm not so sure about the hospitality side, and those credit cards should be going into meltdown, Richard, from what I've seen happening around the city. But we do need to get our retail sector back and booming, and the first step in that is getting our workers back into the city.
James, can I just go to you just on the public transport part of this discussion too, because the data we did look at recently, you know, did ask the question about getting back on a bus, a train or a ferry or whatever else. What did that tell you across the country? And what did Victoria look like compared to everybody else?
Yeah, so again, similar to we had the issue before, where Victorians are quite concerned around COVID still, and we saw that very much so from a public transport perspective. So there's still a real reticence to get on public transport, particularly in Victoria. And look, some of these campaigns will hopefully kick through and drive some more traffic. But just generally, we're seeing that 75% of Australians who can work from home wish to continue to work from home to some degree. And up to a third of Australians would like to work permanently from home, which is going to be a major issue for our CBDs. But when most people think about working from home, it's actually working from anywhere. And perhaps this is the opportunity for our tourism businesses, in that there's a real appetite from a number of new travellers to work from anywhere. We've seen certainly Bernard Salt labelled them the Vespers, so the virus escapees seeking provincial Australia. So they're kind of moving out permanently. But we've seen a lot of the shorter term digital nomads either moving from town to town or going on short breaks, being able to work away for the week and then come back again. And interestingly enough, there's been a real move to this kind of midsection where we kind of term them the RASs. So this is working remotely and seeking space and experience, and they may end up settling. But these are people that'll go from anywhere from between a month to a year and go and explore places. So I think there's a real opportunity for tourism businesses, and not just in the regions. That's the really important part of the research. A third of these people were actually looking to move or experience other cities. So there's an opportunity for tourism businesses, both at a regional and a metro level, to be able to try and attract these people to come and work from a different place for a while. And that seems to be very attractive to a fair proportion of Australians. And indeed, when we saw this from, we recently did a poll of 300 New Zealanders, and 57% of them, if their employers were to allow it, would actually like to potentially come and work from Australia and then get up 2 hours earlier. So there's an opportunity, particularly for our struggling CBD hotels and others, perhaps to try and attract and drive a campaign to bring some of the Kiwis across the ditch and have them fill up our CBD hotels, bars, restaurants and retail. So there is some green shoots and some opportunities amongst potential tourists that are certainly a very, very different segment.
Thank you, James. Well, I know there's a very cheeky campaign been running in New Zealand about bringing the backpackers over here from New Zealand to pick fruit, etc., etc. But let's talk a little bit about New Zealand. You know, Tracy, I'd probably like to hear your thoughts just on the CBD thing in a larger sense, as well as what you're seeing from a Booking.com point of view. Is this consistent? Is it happening everywhere that CBDs are struggling a bit? And then let's talk a bit about New Zealand.
Yeah, I think probably my sentiment is fairly similar to Leanne. So it depends, I think, in cities as to what other events and things are going on. So I think if a CBD is largely kind of reliant on corporate business, then globally we're seeing challenges there. I think anywhere that there is the ability to gather or to bring people in for events or festivals and other things, we are seeing that there is people will travel to the CBD for leisure if there's a reason to do so. But the challenge is creating enough of those events to gather any momentum. We've also seen, I think, similar research ourselves that we did to James on the willingness of people to work remotely. And we're seeing a lot of accommodation businesses responding well to that. I think the challenge there is around kind of value and making sure that that potentially stays in more commercial accommodation versus perhaps some of the more non-traditional accommodation to keep that moving. But globally, we basically see the same things everywhere, apart from, again, as Leanne already mentioned, China, we see also for us quite strong results, both midweek and weekend and across destinations.
So we're all happy that there's the prospect of New Zealand. Do you think there's a high level of interest? Are you already seeing a lot of traffic via Booking.com, people making inquiries in terms of coming from New Zealand to Australia and vice versa on the off chance?
Both, actually. So we have a high level of business actually that never cancelled, that continues to be optimistic about their ability to travel. So particularly Queenstown in New Zealand for Australians travelling, and then Queensland for Kiwis travelling over with reasonable holdings actually in both countries. In terms of the research that we've done, it's a bit of a one-sided love affair. So Australia is by far the top destination that Kiwis would like to travel to, but as far as it goes the other way around, New Zealand kind of sits about number 7 in terms of destinations that Australians would like to go to. So luckily there's a few more of the population to spread around, but certainly we do see high levels of interest. And I think the safety concerns, actually we don't see a lot of difference between travelling domestically and travelling trans-Tasman in terms of the confidence level of travellers. So we've seen encouraging and very high levels of search. Every time either country's Prime Minister mentions the likelihood, then we see search data surge enormously for those for both countries.
Well, that's good news. And look, on the note of good news, we've only got a few more minutes to go, and we haven't really had too many questions from our audience. You've obviously answered all of their questions, but I'm just wondering if we might finish up by going around and having a chat about what's the biggest positive or opportunity that's come out of the COVID exercise, because we're all spending a lot of time worrying about the day-to-day and getting on. but there also has to be some legacies out of a terrible situation like this. So, Leanne, I might start with you. What's the good news?
Oh my gosh, the good news. The good news is that my regional hotels have never been happier because they've been bursting at the seams. So that's been absolutely wonderful. And I know that our owners of those hotels are just delighted. Look, I also think from a business standpoint, I'm in the office today and we've started to come back to the office slowly but surely. And I've been a proponent of working in a flexible environment for a long time, particularly with an advocate around returning mums coming back to work and providing an environment where we really, offer the ability to give an environment where they can, manage their own time personally. And I think the biggest thing out of this for me on a positive side of things is that is going to be the norm. And that's the same in hotels, right? We've had to find a better way of working in hotels with a much more flexible environment created for our staff. And for an industry, I think that's really incredibly important as we try and attract talent to come back and work in the hospitality industry, which is an industry I'm passionate and love. So that's a good thing.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Leanne. James, from looking around the country, what do you think is, the positive we should be able to take away from this, the thing the industry needs to focus on?
Well, one of the big things we saw prior to COVID was that 40% of Australians were looking to travel overseas, and Australians spend far more overseas than we receive from inbound tourists. So one of the key things is that 70% of those people that had planned to go overseas will now spend that money in Australia, either completely or at least partially. So there is a real opportunity to capture some of that money that was going to be spent overseas, and it's going to be spent with our tourism businesses. And also 2/3 of Australians are feeling very altruistic in that they're very keen to support our tourism businesses and understand they've gone through a very tough time, whether it's drought, bushfires or COVID. So I think that's really positive for the industry.
Excellent. Now, Richard, what do you think the challenge opportunities out of this are? Because there's got to be some good news out of this. There's got to be some things we can learn.
Well, I think there's a lot of positives. We touched on one a minute ago, the rise of flexible working. I think it's been fantastic to see many maybe old school leaders that were not keen on flexible working forced to adopt it and found that it's worked. So I think that does open up the opportunity to people to work remotely, maybe from regional towns, maybe even doing jobs that are based overseas. So I think that means we can get more jobs into regional areas and into Australia that are maybe high tech and will help the economy overall. And then the other thing I think there's a greater sense of community, just people spending time in their community. So I think we might see a regeneration of some of the suburbs that have died back over the last decade. And I hope we don't go back to a world where we're all traveling all of the time and away from family and friends.
Very positive. Tracy, from your point of view?
I mean, I think echo a lot of what the others have said, but I think Australia actually is incredibly lucky if you look at globally. So we are, at least for Booking.com, the country that's probably performing one of the strongest in the world because of the resiliency of the domestic demand. So although it's down and CBD hotels are challenged, I think we are not nearly as challenged actually in Australia as some countries are finding themselves. So I think in terms of a talent retention and also the tourism dispersal to some of the regional areas, particularly as you touched on earlier, that were affected by bushfires very early on, we're seeing actually really strong growth into those destinations and much stronger year-on-year growth. So yeah, very much a two-speed economy, but I think in general, overall, because of the strength of the domestic traveller, we're actually, I think, doing pretty well comparatively to a lot of countries right now.
Well, that's very good to hear. Now, Felicia, I'm going to give you the last word. I mean, I think particularly, as I've said before, difficult times in Victoria, but if anybody can find a positive out of this, it's Felicia Mariani. So over to you.
I wasn't a cheerleader for nothing all my life. It's very American. Sorry, guys. I guess the thing that springs to mind, however, is the old adage that you never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think we can look back and say that I don't think we have let this go to waste. I mentioned before the importance of really putting on steroids, the volume, the power, and the voice of tourism through this exercise. I can't remember a time in my entire history in this industry when the T word was spoken so much on the news. It was on everyone's lips. It was, flavor of the month. Every government in every state that has for years questioned the validity and the all the stuff that we've been saying about the importance of tourism, they get it. They get it now. And, it's terrible that it's taken a disaster like this to happen for governments around the country and indeed around the world to recognize the important role that the visitor economy plays in their sustainability. So that's been a real positive. We're seeing massive investment in tourism here in Victoria. We had an unprecedented budget this year, and the investment in the visitor economy here is in the billions of dollars. So that's been a real positive. And probably the only other thing I'd like to mention, which we haven't touched on enough, is I think the adoption of digital. We laughed about it a little bit coming in and how we've all become so adept at Zoom and all these digital platforms that before COVID we didn't want to touch. But I think as an industry, recognizing the importance of building digital capability, adoption of digital platforms, as you said, Richard, talking about the distribution channels and how do I manage my digital presence in a better way? How do I engage in these online forums? I think our industry has done a remarkable job in maintaining connection with their customers through this whole period through digital platforms. So I think that has been it's really escalated our adoption of digital and the important role that it plays in connecting with our customers.
See, I knew you wouldn't fail me, Philip. Yes, very. That's what we like. Some good news. Well, look, we're just out of time, and I want to thank you all for taking part this morning. Thank you so much, Tracy, Felicia, James, Richard, Leanne, for your insights this morning and for your tremendous support of the industry and, your active energy over the last difficult year. And it simply remains to me to say thank you to all of those who've been watching and to wish you all a very, very happy and safe Christmas, and go out there and have a nice holiday. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Margy.
Thanks, Margy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.